When I called from jail, my mom said, "We're at your sister's gender reveal, figure it out." So I did. I called my lawyer instead. 5 days later, they showed up smiling until the guard handed them an envelope, and their smiles vanished. I, 32M, never thought I'd be the guy making a phone call from county lockup at 3 in the morning, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The holding cell smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps. My one phone call. That's what they tell you about in movies, except they don't mention how your hands shake when you're dialing, or how the metallic taste of fear sits on your tongue like a copper penny. I called my mother first. Force of habit, I guess. When you're in trouble, you call family. That's what I'd been taught my whole life. She answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear music and laughter in the background. Party sounds. Celebration sounds. I told her where I was, that I'd been arrested, that I needed help with bail. The words came out rushed and panicked because I had limited time, and because saying them out loud made everything feel horrifyingly real. She cut me off mid-sentence. They were at my sister's gender reveal party. Pink or blue, confetti and cake, the whole production. She said she couldn't deal with this right now, that I needed to figure it out myself, that I always created drama at the worst possible times. Then she hung up. Just like that. No questions about what happened, no concern about whether I was okay, nothing. Just dial tone and the echo of party music fading into silence. I stood there holding the receiver, staring at the cinder block wall, feeling something inside me crack and reshape itself into something harder. The guard asked if I wanted to make another call. I did. But this time, I didn't call family. I called my lawyer. The arrest itself was a setup, though it took me a while to piece that together. My business partner had been skimming money from our accounts for months, and when the auditors started sniffing around, he'd pointed all the evidence straight at me. Forged signatures, manipulated records, the works. I'd walked into the office that morning thinking it was just another Tuesday, and by noon I was in handcuffs being read my rights while my partner stood there looking appropriately shocked and betrayed. The lawyer I called was someone I'd worked with on business contracts before. Sharp, expensive, and not the type to work for free. I explained the situation as quickly as I could, and he told me to sit tight, not to say anything to anyone, and that he'd handle bail in the morning. His tone was all business, no sympathy, but at least it was competent. At least someone was listening. I spent the night in that cell thinking about a lot of things. About how my family had always treated me like the problem child, even though I'd built a successful business from nothing. About how my sister had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose gender reveal party was apparently more important than her brother's freedom. About how my mother had a habit of dismissing anything that didn't fit her perfect family narrative. But mostly I thought about evidence. About paper trails and digital records and security footage. About everything I'd need to prove my innocence and expose my partner's betrayal. The lawyer got me out on bail by 10 the next morning, and I went straight to work building my case. Not just against my partner, but against everyone who decided I wasn't worth their time. The investigation moved faster than I expected. My lawyer was worth every penny I was paying him. He brought in forensic accountants who traced every transaction, found the offshore accounts my partner had set up, discovered the pattern of theft that had been going on for almost 2 years. We found emails, recorded phone calls, even security footage of my partner entering the office on weekends when I wasn't there. The evidence was overwhelming. But I didn't stop there. While building my legal defense, I started digging into other things. Family things. My sister's perfect life, my mother's finances, the whole glossy exterior they'd all worked so hard to maintain. What I found was interesting. Very interesting. Turns out my sister's husband had been laid off 6 months ago and hadn't told anyone. They were drowning in debt, behind on their mortgage, living on credit cards and lies. My mother knew and had been quietly bailing them out with money she didn't really have. Money that, as I dug deeper, I realized had come from a trust fund my grandmother had left specifically for me. My mother was the trustee, and she'd been slowly draining it to support my sister's lifestyle while telling me the fund was tied up in investments. 5 days after my arrest, my mother and sister decided to visit me, not out of concern, but because they'd heard through the family grapevine that I was out on bail and they wanted to do damage control. Wanted to make sure I wasn't going to embarrass them further, I assumed. Wanted to explain how difficult it had been for them to miss my crisis because of party planning. They showed up at my apartment smiling, those tight, practiced smiles that said they were there out of obligation rather than love. My mother had brought cookies, like I was 10 years old with a scraped knee instead of 32 and facing embezzlement charges. My sister kept checking her phone, probably texting her friends about what a burden I was. I let them in, offered them coffee, played the role of grateful son and brother. Then I handed them the envelope. Inside were copies of everything. Bank statements showing the trust fund withdrawals, records of my mother's payments to my sister, screenshots of text messages between them discussing how to keep me in the dark, a full accounting of how they'd stolen nearly $200,000 from me over 3 years. And at the bottom, a letter from my lawyer explaining that I was pursuing legal action for theft and breach of fiduciary duty. The silence that followed was beautiful. My mother's face went from confused to pale to furious in about 10 seconds. My sister started crying immediately, those practiced tears she'd used to get out of trouble since we were kids. They tried all the usual tactics. How could I do this to family? How ungrateful I was. How they'd only borrowed the money and planned to pay it back. How I was tearing the family apart over money. I let them talk themselves out, then told them both to leave. My mother threatened to cut me off completely, and I reminded her she'd already done that when she hung up on me from jail. My sister said I'd regret this, that everyone would know what kind of person I really was, and I told her I was counting on it. After they left, I filed the civil suit. Then I did something else. I reached out to other family members, the ones my mother had kept me isolated from over the years. Aunts and uncles and cousins who'd heard only my mother's version of every story. I sent them copies of everything, not to be vindictive, but because I was done letting her control the narrative. The responses came back slowly at first, then in a flood. Turns out I wasn't the only one who'd been on the receiving end of my mother's manipulations. My uncle hadn't spoken to her in 5 years because she'd spread rumors about his marriage. My aunt had been cut off for questioning my mother's parenting. 2 cousins had similar stories of being squeezed out of the family for not fitting the perfect image. We all started talking, sharing stories, building a case not just of theft, but of decades of emotional manipulation and control. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Update 1. The criminal case against me fell apart within 3 weeks. My partner tried to maintain his innocence, but the evidence was too solid. He eventually took a plea deal that included full restitution and kept him out of prison by the skin of his teeth. The charges against me were dropped completely, with the prosecutor actually apologizing for not vetting the case more thoroughly before bringing charges. But the criminal case was never really the point. The civil suit against my mother and sister was what mattered. Their lawyer tried to argue that the trust fund money had been used for family expenses, that my grandmother would have wanted it used to help all her grandchildren, not just me. My lawyer demolished that argument by producing my grandmother's actual will, which specifically stated the money was for me alone, for my education and business ventures. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The court proceedings were ugly. My mother tried to paint me as a vindictive son attacking his poor mother. My sister showed up to every hearing looking appropriately tragic, belly growing with the baby she'd revealed with such fanfare. But judges aren't impressed by performances, they're impressed by evidence, and we had binders full of it. During discovery, we found even more. My mother had taken out credit cards in my name when I was in college, maxed them out, and destroyed my credit for years. I'd thought I was just bad with money back then, had worked hard to rebuild my credit score, never knowing she'd been the one sabotaging me from the start. That added identity theft to the charges. My sister's involvement was murkier, but still prosecutable. She'd known about the trust fund theft, had actively participated in hiding it, had even helped forge some of my signatures on withdrawal forms. Her husband, desperate and drowning in debt, had been part of the scheme too. The perfect family was rotting from the inside out. The extended family drama was almost worse than the legal battle. My mother had spent decades positioning herself as the family matriarch, the one who held everyone together, the keeper of traditions and arbiter of disputes. Watching that image crumble was satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. Family members started coming forward with their own stories, their own grievances, their own evidence of her manipulations. Thanksgiving that year was interesting. My mother tried to organize the usual family gathering at her house, expecting everyone to just show up and pretend nothing was happening. Instead, My uncle hosted a competing dinner and invited everyone who'd been burned by her over the years. 3/4 of the family showed up at his house. My mother's gathering was her, my sister's husband, and 2 elderly cousins who hadn't heard about the split yet. Update 2. The civil case settled out of court 6 months after I filed it. My mother didn't have the money to pay back what she'd stolen, but she had assets. The house she'd lived in for 30 years, paid off with my grandfather's life insurance money, had to be sold. Her retirement accounts were garnished. My sister and her husband had to declare bankruptcy, lost their house, moved into a cramped apartment on the wrong side of town. I didn't feel good about any of it, exactly, but I didn't feel bad either. Actions have consequences. Choices have prices. They'd made their choices, and now the bill had come due. The criminal charges for identity theft were harder to prosecute, but the threat of them was enough to force the settlement. My lawyer made it clear that if we didn't reach an agreement, I'd push for prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. My mother was 68 years old. Prison time at her age wouldn't be pleasant. She signed the settlement. My sister gave birth to a boy 3 months after the settlement. She sent me a birth announcement, which felt like either an olive branch or a guilt trip. I couldn't tell which. I sent a gift card and nothing else. I wasn't interested in being the villain or the hero in whatever story she was telling herself. I was just interested in being free of them. The business partner situation resolved itself more quietly. He ended up working a regular job, paying restitution in monthly installments that would take him years to complete. His reputation in our industry was destroyed. No one would partner with him again. I rebuilt the business alone, and it grew faster than it ever had when I was splitting decisions with someone else. But the real change wasn't in the legal victories or the financial recovery. It was in my relationships with the family members who'd also been cast aside by my mother over the years. We started having regular dinners, casual get-togethers, actual relationships based on mutual respect instead of obligation and manipulation. My uncle became something like a father figure, gave me advice on business and life that was actually useful instead of controlling. My cousins became friends. Real friends. One of them asked me once if I regretted pursuing the case, if the money and justice had been worth losing my mother and sister. I thought about it for a while before answering. The truth was, I hadn't lost them. You can't lose something you never really had. What I'd lost was the illusion of them, the fantasy of a loving family that had never actually existed. And what I gained was so much more valuable. Update 3. 2 years later, my mother reached out. Not through a phone call or a letter, but through my uncle, asking if I'd be willing to meet for coffee. No lawyers, no mediation, just a conversation. I thought about saying no. I'd built a good life without her in it, found peace in the distance. But curiosity won out. We met at a neutral cafe, the kind of place with overpriced lattes and uncomfortable wooden chairs. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, like the weight of consequences had physically diminished her. She apologized, or tried to. Said she'd been wrong, that she'd let her favoritism blind her, that she'd convinced herself she was helping everyone when really she'd just been helping herself maintain control. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her if she'd have apologized if she'd won, if she'd maintained her house and her money and her position as family matriarch. Would she have ever admitted wrongdoing? She didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. I told her I appreciated the apology, but that I didn't think we could rebuild what had been broken. Some fractures go too deep to heal. She cried, the real kind of crying instead of the manipulative kind, and part of me felt bad for her. But feeling bad for someone doesn't mean you have to let them back into your life. My sister never reached out. I heard through the family that she and her husband were doing better financially, that they'd both found stable jobs and were slowly climbing out of the hole they'd dug. The baby was healthy and growing. I was glad for that, for the kid's sake. He didn't ask to be born into this mess. The trust fund money, what I recovered of it, went into investments and savings. Some of it I used to help my uncle when he had unexpected medical bills. Some went to my cousins when they hit rough patches. Not loans, gifts. Because that's what family money should be used for, helping the people you actually care about instead of maintaining appearances. I started dating someone around that time, someone who had no connection to my family drama and knew me only as I was now, not as the black sheep or the problem child or the vindictive son. She asked me once about my family, and I gave her the short version. She said she admired that I'd stood up for myself, that a lot of people would have just accepted the mistreatment because they were afraid of being alone. I told her I'd learned something important through all of it. Being alone isn't the same as being lonely. You can be surrounded by family and feel completely isolated, or you can build your own circle of people who actually value you and feel completely connected. Blood doesn't guarantee love, and DNA doesn't guarantee loyalty. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. 3 years after that phone call from jail, I'm doing better than I ever have. The business is thriving. I have relationships with family members who actually respect me. I have friends who show up when I need them. I have a life built on honesty instead of obligation, on mutual support instead of manipulation. Sometimes I think about that night in the holding cell, about how desperate and scared I felt making that call, about how my mother's rejection, as painful as it was in the moment, was actually a gift. It forced me to stop relying on people who'd never been reliable, to stop hoping for love from people who'd never known how to give it. I called my lawyer instead of calling back to beg, and that decision changed everything. Not because lawyers are better than family, but because I finally learned to seek help from people who were actually equipped and willing to help me. I learned to value competence over sentiment, action over words, results over promises. The envelope I handed them that day wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about accountability. It was about saying that actions have consequences and that I wasn't going to be the family scapegoat anymore. It was about taking back the power they'd held over me for 32 years and using it to build something better. Their smiles vanished when they opened that envelope because they'd expected me to fold, to forgive, to go back to being the person they could use and dismiss whenever convenient. They'd expected me to value peace over justice, family loyalty over self-respect. They were wrong. Looking back now, I don't regret any of it. Not the lawsuit, not the family split, not the hard conversations or the lost relationships. Because what I lost was never really mine, and what I gained is worth more than any trust fund or family approval. I gained myself. I gained freedom. I gained the ability to look in the mirror and respect the person looking back. And that, more than any legal victory or financial recovery, is what makes the whole thing worth it. I figured it out, just like my mother told me to, just not in the way she expected.